There's been this myth perpetrated that children benefit, or it does no harm to children to be in childcare from the earliest stages. This is not true. It's not good for children, and there's increasing data coming out showing, I'm afraid, that it's not good for children to be in childcare. I put my own children in childcare, but if you look at the data, this is what it says. And I think as women, we need to rebel against this patriarchal culture that's been forcing us out into work, really. And we need to say, no, stop. We want to look after our children. We want to be at home.
Today on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with Belinda Brown, researcher, author and commentator on issues of gender, family and community. Belinda writes for The Conservative Woman and is also a patroness of the Scottish Family Party. I'm Lee Hall and this is British Thought Leaders. Belinda Brown, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Thank you for inviting me.
In recent times, many of the qualities that have been seen as traditionally feminine have been under attack, really. Women are encouraged to be independent and competing with men. How do you see this, the change in society?
I look at that from quite a long-term perspective. I've been studying the women's movement and feminism for many years, and I think it's been part of a movement from where society was mainly focused around the private realm. If we're talking, say, pre-industrial revolution in the UK, I think the US was an agrarian society for longer, and during those times the whole of life was focused around the private realm. And when that was the case, women were at the centre of society because they were, in a sense, at the centre of the private realm. And then when the Industrial Revolution happened, there was a gradual movement outside of the private realm. And I actually think it's not just that women have been sort of pushed away from their, let's say, more feminine roles. It's that actually both men and women have moved from, say, a more family-oriented role towards a more, what shall we say, labour force-oriented role. I think it's not just that women have become, let's say, less sort of womanly or less archetypally womanly. I think both men and women, I think that our identities as men and women are actually forged in the family. They're forged in our roles as parents in relation to our children. And as we've moved away from that, we've lost that sort of male and female, man, woman identity.
So who would you say is behind that kind of push? How did it happen?
This is it's a very big question. You know, and in the first instance, I think, you know, you've got processes of industrialisation happening, and I think that you know, this came from women as much as anyone, and actually in the early days you see a sort of split between those women who, like, say, Mary Wollstonecraft and others, Grimke, I think, in the US, who very much valued the private realm role for both men and women, and felt that in this role we both developed strengths of character through this location in the private realm, and pushed for equality for men and, you know, for women in the private realm. To those women who said, no, you know, now it's out here. Let's all move into the workplace, into the state, and pushed for that. Now, but that's at the sort of superficial level. I think there are much bigger stories going on, which I can try to explain if you'd like me to. But it's difficult to know where to start because there's so many different threads to the story. But what I think is that at the same time as all this was going on, you do have various ideological movements. The most obvious one was of course communism, and you know. But that was that. If we get to and indeed, you know, if you look at the things that Lenin said, if you look at early, you know, this was very much taken up by the feminists. But what I'd like to look at, I mean, maybe I think that I'll take this from a different angle. It's tricky because I know what. Well, there's also, I'm going to be jumping the gun and going ahead to other questions, if that's okay. The way that I started thinking about it, or thought about it, is if you look at society today, I actually see what is an incredibly patriarchal society. It's interesting because I've always fought against feminism, and the feminists have always said we exist in a patriarchy, and you know, as someone who fights feminism, I should disagree with that, but I don't. I think that society is patriarchal, but I actually see patriarchy in a very different way. I'm a social anthropologist. And as a social anthropologist, patriarchy is simply a system of organisation. It's a hierarchical system of organisation where actually the person at the top of the hierarchy can often be controlled by the person at the bottom of the hierarchy. Patriarchy isn't in itself something negative. It can be used for bad and it can be used for good. It's simply a form of social organisation. Now, I think we actually live in a society which is very negatively patriarchal. And this is, you know, we have, COVID has really taught me this, and I don't want to go too much into that whole subject, but what I've become aware of through what's been happening is that we live in an enormously top-down controlled society where, you know, you've got sort of four men controlling a huge, enormous amount of wealth, where, you know, every aspect of our lives is monitored and it's going more and more and more in that direction, a very controlled society. And it's incredible that this has actually come to be after 70 years of a movement which is ostensibly fighting patriarchy. And the thing is, when I actually look at it, what I see is a movement which has inadvertently been promoting patriarchy. And I'll explain how I think this has happened. You see, the way I see it, you've got your sort of patriarchy as a form of social organisation, and you've got patriarchy in the family. And the lower level patriarchy acts as a counter and a balance on this higher level patriarchy. But what we've seen over the past 70 years, past 3 generations, is a complete sort of destruction of this lower level patriarchy, a destruction of the family. And this, I would argue, had the capacity of acting as a counterweight to that higher level patriarchy. But we've had this really ongoing destruction of the family happening at many different levels. And this was brought about by the feminists. And this is where I'm getting back to the question you asked me, who's behind this? Now, this was brought about by the feminists, but when you look at the early feminists and what they were talking about, you start to see that what they were saying had actually come out of earlier and other ideological movements happening at the same time. And when you look at it, it's really quite striking. You know, the feminists were there saying, we're going to destroy the patriarchy. But when you look at everything that they were preaching, the roots of this lay in ideologies which were spouted or whatever by white, sort of white, well-off, males. You could say they were the patriarchy themselves. And you can see this. I mean, the most obvious one, which I think a lot of people know about, is the Frankfurt School. But it's really, when you start looking at it, it's really striking the way in which the feminists actually took up the things which they were arguing against. And the Frankfurt School these people did actually want to destroy society as it actually was at the time. It was a close offshoot of the whole communist movement. I think it actually did start, you could say the roots of the Frankfurt School were in Moscow. It then went to Frankfurt and it then moved, I think it was to New York, but it moved to the US. And if you look at the things that they were saying first of all, they avoided calling it communism. They called it dialectical materialism, but it was, fairly communist, but the sorts of things, they were absolutely clear amongst themselves that they wanted to destroy the family. If you look at Fromm and Marcuse, Horkheimer, if you look at this is something that they wanted to do, but they called it patriarchy because nobody would go along with destroying the family, so they called that patriarchy. The other thing which they did, and they had tools at their disposal, so there was this whole theory, Adorno, he created this idea of the authoritarian personality to explain Nazism. And this was very useful because, anybody who believed in tradition or believed in family, they could just say that they were authoritarian. And that was another way in which they could destroy the family. And then they talked about sexual repression. Actually, if you look at the early women's movement, which I would be very supportive of, this was about sexual integrity. The women of the early women's movement were in favour of men practising chastity so that they wouldn't get pregnant all the time. They actually exercised quite a lot of control over their menfolk. It wasn't about repression. It was seen as something positive, practising a positive virtue in order to develop self-mastery, for example. But this was all portrayed as sexual repression, and the answer to sexual repression was promiscuity. And you can look at, for example, the words of Marcuse and what he said about, promiscuity, and you can look at the words of Kate Millett, 10, 15 years later, and they match up almost exactly. And there are many other ways you can just trace the feminists back to this Frankfurt School. There are many ways, but one of the strongest, actually, I suppose this isn't exactly the Frankfurt School, but the whole abortion issue. So, this is portrayed, it's quite clever because it's portrayed as if this is what women want and the men are against it. The truth about abortion was completely different. So, for example, Margaret Sanger had actually been really strongly against abortion, and it wasn't until she died and a man, I can't remember his name, took over Planned Parenthood that they brought in abortion. But the people who brought in abortion were actually, it was someone called Larry Lader and Nathanson. And we know this story because Nathanson at some point saw an embryo, he saw an image of an embryo and he suddenly converted, I don't know how many abortions they'd been responsible for, but suddenly he became anti-abortion. And then he told the story of what happened. And the story actually was that Larry Lader was he was very much in favour of abortion. Now, you might ask, why was he in favour of abortion? Now, you have to remember that what the early women's movement wanted to do, it wanted to be able to combine women's home domestic role with some participation in the workplace, which would mean some kind of maternity, perhaps maternity pay, perhaps a bit of childcare. It was quite gentle. It wasn't, this farming children off. And this would put big financial demands, I think, on the market system. And I think this was part of the push. This is more hypothetical, but I think this was part of the push for abortion because they had this whole new wonderful labour force of women pouring into the market, and they didn't want them going out of the labour force because they were all having babies. And abortion acted as a stop on that. And, it's quite interesting when this latest, when Roe v. Wade fell recently, the organisations which were all coming out and saying, we'll pay for your abortions, we'll pay for your abortions. It was all the big companies, Amazon and so forth. I've got a whole list of them who are out there offering to pay for women's abortion. So you have to understand abortion was necessary for men and for industry. And it was quite interesting because when Lader and Nathanson were discussing how to get this abortion through, Lader was saying, we've got to recruit Betty Friedan. We need Betty Friedan. She's the one who can push it through. Betty Friedan, like Margaret Sanger had been, was absolutely against abortion. She was really against abortion. Nathanson, interestingly, wasn't so sure about this, because the people in favour of abortion at that time tended to be men. They tended to be doctors and lawyers, and he was worried that if all the sort of wacky feminists started being in favour of abortion, this would put the men off it. But Leder said, no, this is the way to do it. And he was a clever strategist, and he knew that you had to have an enemy in order to push something, and he decided that the enemy would be the Catholic Church. This was completely... he made that quite clear. It's explained by Nathanson in his accounts. Now, what happened then? He also wrote a book. I mean, he was a master at propaganda. He had a lot of his own money, and eventually, through actually some absolutely false statistics about the number of backstreet abortions, he managed to convince Friedan to push for abortion in the National Organisation of Women, and abortion came to be. But it's quite interesting how, when you look at the sorts of things these feminists were saying, I was looking, for example, at Ty Grace Atkinson. She was a big feminist at the time. She was talking about the Catholic Church. This was the bastion of evil. But this, of course, came directly from people like Leder. And you can see in so many of these narratives that the feminists were pushing, they were pushing the blooming narrative of the patriarchy. The feminists were pushing the narrative of the patriarchy. And this is why, when you look at society today, we've actually got a society where women, data shows, women are the ones who have become unhappier, significantly unhappier, rather than men, although men, it has had many negative effects in the high suicide rates. And when you look at, for example, the way we conduct sex lives, that must be like a men's dream. It's like back then, at the early women's movement, women were pushing for what was called voluntary motherhood, which meant chastity until we decide we want to have a baby, sort of thing. That was the early women's movement. Yet we've arrived at a place where what's cool is hookup culture, and you have magazines. Louise Perry wrote about this really eloquently. Magazines which are explaining to women how not to get emotionally involved when you have sex. And so this is what I think has actually happened. Is that it's feminists who, instead of promoting the interests of women, have actually been promoting... They haven't really been promoting the interests of men. Absolutely not. It's definitely not been in the interests of men, but it's been in the interests of this top, elite, most wealthy, most powerful men, the interests of the sort of tip of the patriarchy.
So is the tip of the patriarchy... It doesn't matter whether they're men or women so much. They're just extremely powerful, wealthy, small amount of people.
It's interesting because, of course, there is the odd woman, in this group. And indeed, it is more about structure than sex. But I do believe that social structure does in some way reflect the sex of the person. And I do believe it's more of a masculine male, I believe in sex difference. And I'm not sure that women would have come out with this whole construction of how society ought to be organised. I think that was a male patriarchal thing. And it still exists, Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, all that stuff. Sure, there are women in there, but it takes men, and men isolated from women, men off able to go onto their own, world, to create this whole idea about how they want society to look. So I would say that it is a more male thing, which I'm not blaming men and I'm not blaming women. I'm done with all of that. And I think that if we want to start playing the blame game, it did require feminists to fall for all of this for it to happen. We're all equally responsible. We're all equally culpable. But I would say that although I see patriarchy as a kind of social structure, it is bound in with masculinity. And I think that, I've been thinking about this, and I'll try out this idea because it's just an idea I had and I'm not sure about it. But when I look around me, and this particularly, again, it's happened with COVID. So I'm a researcher, and right from the beginning of the COVID thing, I was following the data, and I could see that the stories coming out in the news didn't tally with the data. I don't, it's not really a topic I want to go into, but as a researcher, I could see at so many levels, this is the data, this is the story that they're pushing. But I noticed that, I wrote articles, but I also spoke to friends, friends who've got respect for me, friends who know that I'm a fairly sensible person. I spoke to people and I found that it doesn't matter. You can give people all the data, you can tell them all the facts, but if someone who they perceive as powerful and in authority is saying something, they can't help but believe it. And what I've come to believe is that as human beings, we have a kind of patriarchal tendency. People will believe those in power who are telling them certain things, unless someone comes along and really, really proves to them that those in power are false. And I was thinking about it. It reminded me back of when I was at university. I was at a very left-wing place. I was at the London School of Economics, and my father would say to me, that these were left-wing arguments, and I'd get really upset. This is what I was being taught at university, and therefore it was true. If you tell a child that their teacher isn't saying the truth, they get really upset. And this, I believe, is that we do have a tendency towards kind of attaching too much importance to the person at the top than we should. And that's why, we do actually need those people at the top to go through rigorous kind of competence and truth tests in order to be there, because we're going to believe them. And this is not what we have. We've utterly destroyed the mechanisms. If you look back at our tribal society, the people who are at the top of this hierarchy would have won many contests. They would have proved their worth. They wouldn't have got there without that. But we've been destroying patriarchy in some sense. And so the people at the top are they are absolutely not people that we can trust. They're people that we know we can't trust. We know they are unscrupulous, often extremely dishonest, out, with their own self-interest. But human nature is to trust them. And so this is why it's so important that actually we need sound people to be at the top. But I can't...
So you're saying that it's human nature that we need these figures at the top, and what we need to focus on is getting good figures at the top who can be trusted.
That's right. But also we need to have I think that the family patriarchy provides strength at the bottom. It provides a counterweight. Patriarchy should always be steered and driven and directed by the people at the bottom. That's what, even when I realised when I looked at anthropological societies, the king was the subject of the people. And this is the structure of patriarchy. And yet what we've been doing is thoroughly eroding that whole counterweight, which is the family at the bottom. And that's what we need to be rebuilding. That's what I'm really concerned about, is what's happened to that family.
You called marriage the bedrock of society. Could you talk to us a bit about the importance of marriage and kind of where it is in today's society, really?
Yeah, I really do think marriage is the bedrock of society. And this is because I believe that we need to rebuild the family. And without marriage, the family is, in a sense, reduced to the mother and child unit. I want to make it clear, I'm a single parent myself, okay? I've got quite a complicated family background, so, I'm not knocking anything, but I believe that family is a mother and father and children. And I believe that in order for the father to be an integral part of the family, there needs to be marriage, and that without marriage, the father's position in the family is very vulnerable, which is what we've seen. It's quite interesting, actually, because if you look at, I've been talking about these Frankfurt School people, I've been talking about the feminists, and one of the things they really wanted to destroy and have destroyed in all sorts of ways was marriage. And I think that indicates its power. Why would they want to destroy it so much if it wasn't powerful? And the reason it's powerful is because it brings the man as a central pillar of the family, which which is very important, because the mother, through nature, the mother and child bond is absolutely clear to everybody. Child is born, we know who the mother is. But the father's role with the child is always mediated by the mother, and I think, was it Townsend or Stephen Knox? There's been lots of research into the family in the days when perhaps it was slightly more familiistic than it is now. But what they showed was that the father's role is very much mediated by the mother. It's the mother who decides whether the father is going to be the disciplinarian or the fun person for when the children get home. It's the mother who knows what the children are doing at all times. It's the mother who sort of sets the tone for the family. And if there is divorce, it tends to be the father who sees significantly less of the child. And even there's a researcher called Andrea Doucette, and she did a lot of research into full-time fathers, fathers who look after the children from the earliest ages. And even these fathers felt that there is a natural bond between the mother and the baby, which sort of the father didn't have in the same way. None of which is to say that can I make clear, I believe the father is absolutely just as important as the mother, and that's why marriage is so important, because marriage brings the father into the family. But there are many other sort of really marriage has very practical effects in all sorts of ways. I mean, one of the things is that when you get married, you are showing someone else this very high degree of trust. And there's research to say that when you show someone trust, it actually has a positive effect on their behaviour. So, there is no greater sign of trust than saying, I'm marrying you. So it does actually bring out a positive aspect of human nature. But the commitment, which is also involved in marriage, and may I say that although our divorce laws have greatly weakened that commitment by weakening marriage, the public still recognises the importance of marriage. Marriage, if I should say, predates the state. It's a natural institution. We have a natural feeling for marriage, and this commitment is itself a very generative, has a very generative function in all sorts of ways. What you find is when people are married, and let's say if we compare marriage to cohabitation, people who are married are more prepared to take risks. The mother will be more prepared to spend time with her children because she feels safe. A cohabiting mother may be more keen to invest in her employment because she doesn't quite know what's going to happen tomorrow. The married father will invest in his family. He won't go out and buy the latest car because this is, he believes this is an institution which will last. And it's also generative in the sense of, if you look at married men, all the data shows that married men earn more than unmarried men. Marriage actually provokes men into being more productive, working harder, and people start investing when they get married. Marriage is an enormously wealth-generating institution. And why I think marriage is so important now is that we have this really patriarchal society, and what we need to do is strengthen. We need to strengthen the grassroots. And the way to do this is through marriage. And the thing is, even if the state came out tomorrow and banned marriage, human nature would recreate it. Marriage comes from us. Yes, the state can back it up. And the state used to support marriage because, it supported marriage because it saw marriage as the best institution for bringing up children. And this is what the data shows. Children who grow up with married parents, in the statistics, they come out a whole class higher. If you look at the data on this, it really has an enormously beneficial effect. So marriage is great for children. So the state provided legal support to marriage. and it backed up, in a sense, an institution that was already there. So at this time, when we're so threatened by this central authority that wants to control every aspect of our life, what we need to do is rebuild from the bottom up. And this needs to be built on marriage. And there is another aspect of marriage which I think is tremendously important, which is that we currently, as I was explaining, you know, the sort of homo laborans, or whatever you want to call it, this sort of the individual, we've been encouraged to exist just as individuals, laws unto ourselves. But what happens in marriage is that suddenly your own good is achieved through the good of the other person, if you see what I mean. You want the best for the other person. What is best for the other person is the best for you. And in this is how community works. Community is about how your own well-being depends on the well-being of others. And this is why marriage is the first cell doing that, where your well-being depends on the well-being of your husband or your wife. So marriage is important in that sense. And there are many other ways. I think marriage is really important for the development of identity. And I think this is why, what's her name? Primal Scream, Eberhardt. I can't remember the name. There's a really good book written about how the reason we're falling for all these kind of group identities, we're latching onto them like anything, is because that primary familial identity has been destroyed, and it's because the family has been destroyed. And I remember she cited research about children from, and I'm a child of divorce, you know, children from divorced parents, their identity is much weaker. It's sort of split between these two families. So there are so many ways in which marriage is really enormously important, and I could probably talk even more about it, but you know, and we've lost sight of this because it's, you know, it's like, what's the difference between marriage and cohabitation? Well, there is actually there's a lot of difference, and this is in the data. The statistical data shows really massive differences between marriage and cohabitation. And one thing I just want to point out is that this is now being lost by the data, because what a lot of statistics will do is they will put cohabitation, marriage, all kinds of marriage, civil union, they'll put them all together in one basket. So the specific differences of, you know, man-woman marriage kind of disappear in this sort of statistical agglomeration of these other types of union. So, you know, we need to be careful when we look at the data, but this is what the data shows, that marriage really is different from cohabitation and other forms of social organisation. So
you've talked quite a bit about family, and family's been under attack since Marx, really, right at the start.
Yeah.
And now it seems almost having a child is kind of looked upon as a sign of being oppressed. We can see this in the reproduction rates, which have taken quite a hit in the West. I mean, what can women do about this?
Yes, it's a really tricky question. I mean, I feel that it's not so much that having a child. It's not so much that having a child is viewed negatively. It's that there is so much value attached to having a career and to establishing your identity outside the family, and also that simply, or if you look at the whole tax and benefits system, this makes it really difficult to just look after your child. So I think that there are all these social forces, and if you look at the data, if you look at the policy formation, which I have looked at, this is not a coincidence. I mean, there are documents, you know, written by Patricia Hewitt and others, which were determined to, you know, get women out to work, to destroy marriage, and so forth. And I think that what we need to do really is find ways of giving men and women the opportunity to be with their children, I mean, there are practical, at the state level, the whole tax and benefit system needs to shift so that actually, because at the moment, people with children are hugely penalised by the tax and benefit system. And the other group that's hugely penalised is if you live together and only one of you is earning. So single earners and people who have children are really, you look at the data, massively penalised. It's quite shocking. They pay thousands and thousands more in tax. So we really need to change that so that people can look after their children. At the moment, the only people who can look after their children are the very wealthiest. Those are and I'm not saying, I think both men and women, I think children are very important to both men and women. I'm not making, I think men and women have very different roles in relation to children, but both have equally important roles. So we need to find ways that women can look after their children. And I think that we need also to, do you know what? Women don't actually know. There's been this myth perpetrated that children benefit, or it does no harm to children to be in childcare from the earliest stages. This is not true. It's not good for children. And there's increasing data coming out showing, I'm afraid, that it's not good for children to be in childcare. I put my own children in childcare, but if you look at the data, this is what it says. And I think we do need to raise a bit of awareness about this, because at the moment, I remember thinking it would be good for my child to go to nursery when she was very young. I want to do this for her. That's not what the data's showing. It's not good for children in all sorts of ways. So we need to get that information out there about the impact of childcare. And I think that we need to give parents the opportunity through the tax and benefit system of looking after their children. And then I think they will do so. I mean, at the moment, I think the government just recently came out with a new proposal. I might have this wrong, or was it a Labour proposal? I can't remember, but wraparound childcare from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening. I used to work in a breakfast club, and the reason I stopped was because my daughter was so unhappy coming with me in the morning, getting up that early to go to breakfast club. But I can tell you that the children who were getting to that breakfast club first thing in the morning and then going to the after-school club, they were miserable. You could spot them. You could spot them. Childminders can spot them. It's not good for children to spend ages in childcare. It's not good for children to be in childcare from when they're babies. And we need to talk about this. So I think that will encourage women. Mothers like spending time with their children, but I also think we need to talk about how important it is, because the trouble is that we've attached so much importance to having a career that I think women start feeling that they don't have an identity if they don't go out to work, and so I mean, I had big age gaps between my two children, and I really saw a changing culture. And with my older child, who's just about 30, back then there were still, women would get together when their children were very small, and they'd get together and do play groups and this and that, and there was actually a sort of culture around children. But then when I had my second child 13 years later, women were already going out to work, and so the women who wanted to look after their children were much more isolated at home, and they didn't have that workplace identity. I think as women, we need to rebel against this patriarchal culture that's been forcing us out into work, really. And we need to say, no, stop. We want to look after our children. We want to be at home, And I can tell you that after your children have grown up, and it happens very quickly. I mean, in my case, I did have quite a long gap between my kids, so I've probably spent slightly longer at home than other people. But actually, you've got a whole life. If you have your children youngish, you've got a whole life ahead of you when they grow up and leave home. Actually, even when you have I had my second child quite when I was getting on a wee bit, and I've still got a whole life ahead of me. There's this feeling you've got to go out to work. That's sort of culturally created. It's not a truth.
So I think to sum up what I think you're saying, feminists are saying that they need to kind of go out to work to kind of beat the patriarchy, whereas you're saying it's kind of actually the opposite, really. The patriarchal system is putting them in that position, and they should be doing what they want to do, which can be staying at home and looking after their children.
Yes, that's absolutely what I say.
So it's almost an anti-feminist feminist.
Yes, you could almost say that, and it's funny because if you look at the feminist favourite word is choice, but actually women don't have choice. They don't have the choice to stay at home at the moment, and that's the choice that we need to create. It's funny, this word choice it's used very deceptively. It's tempting me to get onto the abortion topic, but actually feminism has taken choice away, and we need to sort of recreate it. And I'm very cautious. I actually don't subscribe to the word feminist because I think feminism does have this certain set of meanings which I don't subscribe to. The early women's movement, those early, not the stuff. Well, don't get me on, but there are lots of things in the early women's movement which, yes, that I'm fine with. But feminism, I think, has been corrupted by the whole Frankfurt School created sexual revolution, which was a sort of patriarchal ideology as far as I'm concerned.
Well, going into that, it was not that long ago, say when I was a teenager, girls would guard their virtue, if you like, and the guys were trying to persuade them otherwise, often unsuccessfully. Whereas nowadays it seems you've almost gone to the opposite extreme. A lot of females are more promiscuous than the males.
Yeah.
What kind of damage do you feel this has done to our society?
Well, actually, it's done damage in all sorts of ways. I mean, you ask about, it has done enormous damage to women, but you're asking about the damage to society, which is it's a very important question and not really a well-addressed question. I think that actually this, if you look at this sort of culture of promiscuity, this actually lies at the root of the breakdown of marriage and the family. I mean, it's probably a topic more for a lecture because it's quite detailed. But it started. Yes, there's the Frankfurt School, but contraception and abortion tore apart the links between sex and marriage, and it was at this point that we started to see this very encouraged by the ideology, this sort of promiscuous culture emerge, which has ended up with a hookup culture. And I think that there are many negative effects. I think for as long as sex is freely available outside marriage, that is going to act as a drag on marriage. That's going to discourage marriage. If men can get sex outside of marriage, there is less. I think that will discourage marriage. And I think also if people can easily get sex outside of marriage, that weakens marriage once you're in it. So I think that the culture of promiscuity is linked to the breakdown of the family, very much so. But I think that it's also been really negative for men because one of the arguments that my husband Jeff Dench used to make, he wrote a lot about men. Sadly, he passed away some years ago. But he used to say that, the reason that men do so many amazing things, their drive to, get great jobs, to produce art, to make money, to build houses, is because they want to, it's their drive to reproduce. It's their male libido. The male libido it's a tremendous source of energy which can either be channeled into sexual promiscuity or it can, in old-fashioned days, that male libido, which is a tremendously creative force, could be channeled into creativity. And that's what young men used to be taught, to channel their libido into, do well at school, build things, do things. You know, it can either go in that way, which now, you know, maybe pornography has taken over a lot of the negative, you know, channel libido in a very, very negative way, or it can be channeled in a very positive, non-sexual way into creativity, which actually is, it's the male peacock, you know. Men create things in order to attract the female, and so the libido would channel them into creating all sorts of wonderful things to attract the female. But once the females are just available, once sex is just available, once pornography is just available, then, you know, that libido ceases to be channeled into something that's creative and productive, and I think you start to have a decline of society. And actually, this has been documented by the 1930s anthropologist called Unwin. He wrote a book on sex and culture, and he actually provided fantastic evidence to totally back this up. You know, he showed that societies which practiced monogamy and prenuptial chastity reached the sort of peak of, you know, cultural well-being, and societies which gave up on this just declined. So I think that this whole promiscuity thing actually has has even greater negative consequences than the mental health implications for women, which it does have. I think it has big social implications, both through its impact on the family and the destruction of the family, and its impact on men. So, yeah.
You're currently working on research into fatherhood. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the role of fatherhood in contemporary Britain?
Yes, I think it's I think as a you know, the feminists in the 1980s, Hewitts and Harmans and this and that, you know, various feminists were very determined. I've got articles by Polly Toynbee, you know, they were determined to see the father as an optional extra to the family. Actually, no, I would say that the father is the central spine to the family. You know, families really absolutely need fathers. But I think, you know, and this is, you know, and there is so much data in all sorts of ways to show the importance of fathers to children at all sorts of levels. You know, if you look at pre-industrial societies, you know, childhood mortality was so strongly linked to the presence or absence of a father. A child's outcome all through their life is linked to the presence or absence of a father. Every single negative variable, you know, crime, health, education, employment, everything is linked to the presence or absence of a father. So, you know, I think we need to realise how important fathers are to families. But one of the things which also does trouble me is that there's been a bit of a tendency to assume that the father is just another childminder like the mother. You know, in anthropology we call it the alloparent. And what I'd like to emphasise is that fathers actually have a really distinctive role. Mothers and fathers have very distinctive roles in relation to the child. And the way I see it is that the mother provides, in a sense, the embrace, the direct caring and protection of the child. And the father provides the bridge for that child to go out into wider society. And if you look at, you know, psychologists have looked in depth at the different ways in which mothers and fathers interact with their children from when they're born. There are differences. And it's interesting, it actually turns out babies prefer playing with their daddies. Their daddies play in more exciting ways, and children get more fun with playing with their dads. But this goes, you can look at it in many different ways. What fathers do is they help the child develop independence. They prepare the child for functioning in wider society. One thing, if you look, an example of this, if you look at how the mother and father approach to problem solving, let's say something's happened that's made the child deeply unhappy. The mother's desire, which is both equally valuable, is to comfort the child, comfort and console the child. The father's approach is to try to solve the problem. And in a sense, this takes the child out of themselves to think more about the wider world. And there is actually research which shows that children with fathers who've grown up with active fathers actually have more empathy than children who don't have fathers. I've read that somewhere. I can't remember the citation, but I have read that children who have actively involved fathers are more empathic. And I think that the father's role is to help the child move out into wider society. And I think we need to recognise that mothers and fathers do have different roles, equally important for the child and different. So I think that we need to bring the father back into the family and realise his central importance. But at the same time, I think this is really important for boys growing up. My husband and I, we did some research. His hypothesis was that boys who had some awareness, who were more traditional in their thinking, would be more motivated in school. What I mean by this is that boys who grew up thinking that they will have a family and that they will have a role supporting that family will be more motivated in education. And it was only a small study. It's very, very difficult to get funding for that sort of thing because, they like to say that families can survive without fathers. You'll find this written in all sorts. So it's difficult to get funding, but we did manage to get about a case sample of 300. And we did find the beginnings of evidence. I think we found that boys who thought that they would have a certain number of children were much more interested in their schoolwork. The boys who said no, they wouldn't have any children, and the boys who said, yeah, I'm going to have 20 children, they weren't so interested in the schoolwork. And there was this link between foreseeing a family role and being interested in schoolwork. And I think this could be the missing link of why boys without fathers do worse at school, because they're not quite sure what their role is. I think what you have to remember is that for the child, the small child, their universe is their family. Their universe isn't out there yet. The small child, the universe is their family. And the mother has an obvious central importance in that universe. And you need to have the father there for the little boys so that they too see that they have a central importance. Even if that father is out at work, as long as that work is recognised as a central contribution to the family, the boy can see that he has a role for himself. The boy without the father isn't quite sure what his role is going to be. So he isn't quite sure what all this work at school is for. So I think that fatherhood is tremendously important in providing a kind of, steering light for boys. And, at the end of the day, for both boys and girls, family is really important, the idea that we will have families. And I often think this is why girls don't need so much motivation, because we know we can get pregnant, we know we can have a baby at any time, and we know if we've got that baby we're going to need to look after it. So we've kind of got this natural internal motivation, whereas the boy's role is a bit more outside of that, and so it needs to be culturally constructed that he has a key and central role in the family. And this is what you'll find in pre-tribal societies. You'll find that, during the teenage years, boys are taught skills like hunting and house building, and they go through initiation ceremonies, and when they've achieved all these skills and they're seen as ready for marriage, it gives a structure to their lives. Whereas we live in a culture which has been determined to say, we don't need you, and so boys, then you get all the delinquency, and, then you get the toxic masculinity, a hugely overlooked term, but if you say to boys you're no use and you're toxic, well, self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm sure I could say more. I think fatherhood is really important, and I think we need to draw attention to it. So that's why I've become really interested in it.
We've touched on a lot of different issues today. What, in a kind of nutshell, can be done to bring hope for the future? What measures do you feel?
We need to rebuild the family, we need a rebirth of the family. We need to, the most rebellious action you can do these days, and I should say it's not an easy thing to do, because I'm afraid because of feminists, they've created such a hostility, it's tragic, between young men and women. They've done so much to disrupt the relay in so many ways, not just feminists, please let me not just blame them. Lots, I don't want to just blame feminists. There are all sorts of forces which have done so much to disrupt the relation between men and women, and especially young men and women. But I think the most sort of rebellious and yet most constructive thing that we can do is rebuild a family, get married, have children, educate those children. I think there's space for home education. What's happening in schools at the moment is terribly worrying with the whole sex education and trans thing. Get married, have children. It's funny because the whole thing that we've been taught to rebel against, I actually think is the most transformative action that we can take to challenge what I see as we've got a really serious authoritarian top-down society is coming upon us. For those with their eyes open, we can see this happening in all sorts of ways, and we've got to create this strong private realm, and not just family, also our friendship networks. We've got to build strong networks at this private level, and so that we can make demands on the powers that be, so that we can be the ones telling them what to do, because at the moment they are the ones steering and directing us. No, we've got to reverse that relationship. We've got to be making them serve our needs, because after all, it's us people, us families, our mothers, fathers, children. It's us people this is what society is all about, and the government should be there to serve our interests. At the moment, we tend to be, working in the interests of some great big global organisations up there. So, yes, that's what I think we should be doing.
Belinda Brown, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much for taking an interest in what I have to say. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Lee.